We've heard it before. What some call fake foods are bad for our health. That hasn't stopped us, though, because processed foods are the primary source of calories in the United States, and they cause dozens of serious, even fatal illnesses. Eating fast food 2 or 3 times a week increases the risk of dying from heart disease, which is the leading cause of death in America, by more than 50%. But the standard American diet does much more. It's linked to the modern epidemics of stroke, cancer, autism, Alzheimer's disease, and chronic illness.
Yeah, it is incredible. You have been talking about this for years, yet the consumption of these foods, the consumption of ultra-processed foods all over the globe appear to be on the rise.
Totally.
So can you talk to us a little bit about ultra-processed foods? What are they exactly, and why are they so problematic for our health?
Well, historically, we've evolved eating foods in their original states in the complex matrix of fiber, vitamins, minerals, protein, fat, and carbohydrates. And they're in a rich array of phytochemicals and other matrices that make our bodies be able to manage and handle these things. Ultra-processed foods are essentially food-like substances that are made from highly processed ingredients from some commodity crops, soy, wheat, and corn mostly, that are then turned into all sizes, shapes, colors of chemically extruded substances that bear no resemblance to the original form and cause all sorts of havoc in our biology, aside from all the preservatives, additives, thickeners, artificial sweeteners, things that are also problematic for health. But just the processing of the food itself in a way that pulverizes it into something that isn't resembling food at all and then reassembles it in a way that actually is harmful to our biology. It's quickly absorbed. For every 10% of your diet that's ultra-processed food, your risk of death goes up by 14%. And in America, 60% of our diet is ultra-processed food. In kids, it's almost 70% of their diet. This is just a deadly combination, whether it's fatty liver in kids that need liver transplants or kids who are, having heart attacks at 20 years old because of this. I mean, it's really pretty frightening.
If I were to prescribe one intervention to extend life, to prevent and reverse chronic disease, it would be to drastically reduce or eliminate sugar and refined starch from your diet.
Be that as it may, when we're talking about inflammation, one of the other things that we have to do when we put people on TPN is we have to put in a long IV. We have to put a long IV in that goes almost to the heart, to the big vessels, because that concentration of sugar in a small peripheral blood vessel, in a small vein, will irritate the lining of that vein so intensely that it'll form blood clots and that it'll cause inflammation and that vein will clot off. Think about that, folks. When we use more than a 5 or 10% dextrose infusion in a vein, and even a 10% dextrose infusion can clot that vein. That's 10 grams in 100 mLs, 10%. Will clot that vein. So what's happening at a microscopic level, what's happening is the sugar, the cells that line the blood vessels are called endothelial cells, and they should be nice and flat and inert. They should have a very nice smooth lining on top of them, completely inert. And blood should just flow by nice and happily. La-di-da-di-da. But what happens is when you put sugar in, the sugar very quickly gets into those endothelial cells and it activates them. They round up and they bulge into the lumen, so they narrow the lumen. They also start exposing little parts of the underlying basement membrane, the underlying structure of the vessel wall, not protected by these nice smooth cells. And those places are procoagulant. They form little blood clots. The clotting factor comes in, your fibrin, clots form, platelets get in there, platelets get activated. That's my PhD. And then it attracts lymphocytes and you form this blood clot that clots the blood vessels. So we've learned, smart humans, somewhat, we've learned to run that TPN into the big blood vessels where the vessels are very wide, there's huge amounts of flow, so there's all this dilution. And the concentration isn't quite enough to cause that kind of damage, at least obviously. At least obviously, because we know that that damage does occur, but not as obviously as in the peripheral veins.
There are 5 modern inventions that are killing us all slowly. And in this short video, I'm going to go over these 5 and tell you what you need to know and help you understand why you should avoid all 5 of these modern inventions to optimize your health. I'm Dr. Ken Berry, a family physician with over 20 years of clinical practice. And we're going to talk about the 5 things that you need to avoid in the modern diet. Now, the very first thing is highly processed grains. Now, wheat, rice, oats, corn, and other grains, you can't eat any of those raw, or you run the risk of having serious health problems. So, the very act of processing grain we've only been able to do for a few hundred years. And indeed, before 100 years ago, which if you look at the totality of human existence on this planet, that's a very modern invention. We've only been highly processing grains, grinding them up into a fine powder, separating the different constituent parts. We've only been doing that about 100 years. And a lot of people think, no, people have been eating bread for thousands of years. Yeah, about 8,000 years. But back then, it was a very coarse grind. They weren't separating the grains up into its different parts. You were at least getting the whole grain cooked very, very thoroughly, which is probably less bad, but still not good when compared to our modern highly processed grains. So number one, you got to stop eating all grains. Don't eat them raw, they'll make you sick. Don't eat them highly processed, or they'll make you fat and pre-diabetic. Number 2 on this list is vegetable seed oils. So did you know that prior to about 1910, no human on the planet had ever eaten or used to cook with canola oil, soybean oil, peanut oil, safflower, sunflower, any vegetable oil. It just was not a thing. We needed modern technology in order to highly process these seeds to turn it into vegetable oil. So back then in 1909, 1910, no one ever thought, gosh, we should take this previous wagon axle lubricant, and before we put it in the human food supply at scale, we should probably do some long-term studies to see if it has any inflammatory effect, if it has any pre-diabetic effect. Nobody thought to do that. They had just found a new use for a previous waste product, and they put it in the human food supply without doing any studies. And also, those long-term studies have still not been done on humans to this very day. The number 3 modern invention is adding sugar to everything. And again, we've been processing sugar for about 4,500 years, still quite modern, but only starting in the early 1970s did food manufacturers start to put sugar in everything, including baby food, lots of sugar. And there's actually a theory that this is the cause of the modern obesity epidemic, is that adding this sugar to baby food not only caused metabolic problems initially in those children, but also set them up for a lifetime of sugar addiction and metabolic disease, and perhaps even affected the epigenetic expression in their subsequent offspring, in their children. And so before 1970, marinara sauce didn't have sugar in it. Before 1970, all of the savory foods that we think of as savory today, they didn't have any added sugar, but now all of them have added sugar, and I highly recommend you avoid sugar in all its forms. Modern invention number 4 that's killing us slowly is fruit juice. Did you know that prior to about 1872, that no human on the planet had a daily glass of orange juice or grape juice or apple juice? It was not a thing. We had no refrigeration. We had no means to mass produce it, mass market it, mass ship it. Maybe you would have a glass of apple juice or orange juice or grape juice once a year. That was it. And now there are millions of people around the world who think that they must have that glass of fruit juice in the morning because it's super, super healthy for them. Again, there's been no long-term studies in humans looking at what are the implications, what are the ramifications. Let's look at how many cavities we form in our teeth in the group drinking fruit juice versus the group not drinking fruit juice. I think that would be an enlightening study. Let's look at metabolic health. Let's look at fatty liver. Let's look at childhood obesity. No one ever did those studies. They just started mass producing and mass marketing fruit juice after 1872. Modern invention number 5 that's killing us slowly is a vegan or a plant-based diet. Now, there have been small cultures in the past that were forced to eat a vegan diet. They had no choice. It was either that or starvation. And so they did so. There's been some philosophers and some religious leaders throughout the millennia who have recommended eating only plants, but it's never been a worldwide trend like it is now. It was in no way, even if you said, I'm just going to eat a vegan diet or just plants only, you would have gotten kicked out of the tribe or kicked out of the village. Like, people back then had enough common sense to know that you got to eat meat and eggs if you want to be healthy and strong and robust and be able to help your people as they fight against this hard life back in the old days. Percy Shelley, a poet, wrote a book back in 1813 promoting a vegan diet or a plant-based diet. And it started then to become popular. So before 1813, this was not on anybody's radar. No one ate a plant-based diet. No one considered it healthy or sane to eat a plant-based diet. But Percy Shelley was a big poet. People looked up to him and they're like, oh, I'm going to check into this. And so slowly over the decades since then, it's become more and more popular. And now that certain powers that be realize, hey, if we're going to kind of take over the world in a totalitarian fashion, we're not going to be able to feed everyone meat and eggs. They're going to have to eat plants because we can grow those cheaply. Even though they're nutrient void, they do keep you from starving to death. And so now we see this very popular plant-based movement that, again, has never been researched long-term in humans, with a control group eating meat and eggs versus a control group of people eating only plants. And then let's follow them for 20 or 30 years. Let's look at cavities in the teeth. Let's look at mental health. Let's look at obesity. Let's look at malnutrition. Those studies have never been conducted to this day. And so those are the 5 modern inventions that I would highly advise you to avoid if what you're looking for is optimal health, optimal strength, optimal mental function. Don't fall for these 5 modern fads. Eat an ancestrally appropriate diet, a proper human diet. This is Dr. Berry. I'll see you next time.
There's one very powerful anti-inflammatory food that is going to surprise you. And I wish I knew about this a long time ago when I had my inflammation. I had a lot of gut inflammation. But you can apply this to any inflammation. This also applies to people with autoimmune diseases. And the answer is meat, specifically beef, the thing that they're trying to get rid of right now. They're trying to get rid of cows because of just some ridiculous reason. But beef gives you a super healing protein, glutamine, that can greatly support your gut and other types of inflammatory conditions, whether you have an autoimmune or some other type of non-autoimmune joint problem or whatever. Now, you can actually take glutamine as well, but beef is the best anti-inflammatory food that you can possibly eat. In fact, before the ketogenic diet, when I was eating all those carbs, and when I switched over to beef, oh my goodness, did I feel better. It was incredible. I no longer had bloating, and it was really weird because I thought that you needed fiber to kind of push things through, but little did I know that beef really calmed the fire down in my gut, and a lot of inflammatory conditions went away. I had arthritis so bad in my hands and my spine, I had no idea it was connected to my diet and primarily all the carbs and grains I was consuming. You just have to try it.
The most common objection to the carnivore diet is that If you only eat one thing, you're too limited. You will develop deficiencies. You can't get all your nutrients from one thing. And when it comes to vitamins and minerals, we're always told that they come from fruits and vegetables. And while that is true, fruits and vegetables contain a lot of vitamins and minerals, that does not mean that meat doesn't have any. And meat actually has plenty if you eat enough. So we're not talking about eating a 4-ounce steak anymore. We're talking about eating all your calories from meat. And also, you're not going to overload on protein, because if you eat meat that has 15 to 20% fat, which is recommended, then you'll get the vast majority of calories from fat. And if you eat 2 pounds of meat, it's about 1 kilo, or if you're a little bit bigger, you might eat 3 pounds, which is 1.5 kilos, then it turns out you get about 60% of your thiamine, which is a B vitamin. The other B vitamins you get between 150 to 920% of the RDA, which is recommended daily allowance. The potassium, which is a mineral, you get over 100%, you get 120% of the recommended daily allowance. Magnesium, you get 75%. Iron, you get 200. And vitamin C, you still get 30%. So we're often told that meat has no vitamin C. That's not true. Even regular steak has some vitamin C. And if you add in a little bit of organ meat like liver, then you quickly get up to 100% of the RDA, even for something like vitamin C. Now, if you're observant, you're going to notice that some of these numbers still don't get up to 100%. Like thiamine's only 60, magnesium's only 75. But what happens is the body uses nutrients more efficiently. For example, with vitamin C, it competes with glucose for the transport mechanism. So the more glucose you eat, the less efficient your vitamin C is. When you cut back on carbs and glucose, then you can use your vitamin C more efficiently. And the same holds true for thiamine and magnesium, because people who go carnivore, they tend to not have deficiency. They don't get scurvy. They don't seem to have any low levels of these nutrients either.
We're told when someone has a heart problem, stop the fats. Why are they told to stop the fats? Because of cholesterol. Isn't that right? So now I want to give you the truth on cholesterol. So your liver makes cholesterol, and your liver makes cholesterol according to the body's demands. And 80% of the cholesterol that your liver makes is made from glucose, and 20% of the cholesterol that your liver makes is made from fat. You see, it's not the butter on the bread, it's the bread under the butter that's the problem. The wrong guy's been shot, I have to tell you. So there are two main types of cholesterol. There's HDL, high density lipoprotein, and there's LDL, low density lipoprotein. HDL is called the good guy because HDL is the carrier, and it carries excess cholesterol back to the liver. That's why it's called the good guy. LDL is called the bad guy. The body doesn't make anything bad. What's LDL's role? Its role is that of a repairer and a rebuilder. That's what it is. That's what it does. But it does something else too, which is also very important. It delivers cholesterol to the brain. Brain loves cholesterol. You know, the fattiest food on the planet with the highest cholesterol levels is breast milk, because that developing brain will not develop without rich amounts of cholesterol and fat. Did you hear that?
Welcome to the Dr. Gundry podcast. Now here's a staggering statistic. Every year around 655,000 Americans lose their lives to heart disease. In fact, it's the leading cause of death in the United States, and it's been that way for the last 80 years. Now granted, COVID has gotten our attention, but it's still heart disease, the number one cause of death. And according to today's guest, the scariest part is this. Most of the common fixes out there, like maintaining low cholesterol levels and taking preventative medicines like statins, may not be helping. In fact, he believes these recommendations are probably doing more harm than good. You're going to want to hear about this. And if you've read my work, you know my guest and I are on the same page. I'm joined by Johnny Bowden, aka the Nutrition Myth Buster, and he's a board-certified nutritionist and expert on diet and weight loss. He recently relaunched his best-selling book, The Great Cholesterol Myth, Revised and Expanded: Why Lowering Your Cholesterol Won't Prevent Heart Disease, and the statin-free plan that will. Whoa, we got to stay tuned for this. On today's episode, Johnny and I will reveal the truth about cholesterol, expose the real villain when it comes to heart disease, and share what you can do today to optimize your health and protect your heart. Johnny, I'm excited to have you join me on the podcast today.
Thank you so much. I'm such a fan of your work as well, and I'm thrilled to be here and discuss this very important stuff with you.
So I want to dive right in. What's the biggest issue with the way the health industry has been tackling heart disease all these years?
Well, that's a big question we could probably talk for an hour about. But I think to start off the discussion about cholesterol and our fear of it and our belief that it predicts heart disease and that if we could only lower it, we would be protected, we need to start right with the way we measure cholesterol. Because people often misunderstand us when we say cholesterol is not important or you don't need to be looking at your high versus low cholesterol. We don't think that there's nothing that cholesterol has to tell us. We think we're measuring it by a technology that's 70 years old and that's incorrect. And what we say is that don't even talk to us about high cholesterol till we know how you're measuring it, because if you're using an outdated and inaccurate way of measuring it, then we have nothing to talk about yet. Your high cholesterol might be masking a perfectly healthy heart profile, and your low cholesterol might be masking a risky one. And that was the case with me, which I'll tell you in just a minute. So the way I try to explain this to people, I live in California, we have very, very strict smog regulations, and we always have to have our cars tested for emissions. So there are these smog testing places, and you have to take your car to one, and then they give you a bill of health, or they give you a non-bill of health, and they say, Mr. Jones, you got to fix this. It's going to cost $1,700. Take it over there. That's what you got to do. And everybody does it because we want to comply with the emissions and because there's no way to get a license if you don't. Well, what if you found out? What if you found out that the device that the garage is using hasn't been calibrated since 1963, that the algorithm doesn't even include the toxins that have been invented in the last 10 years because they weren't invented at the time the machine was first set up, and then it's giving wildly inaccurate readings. So some people might come away with their car saying, God, I got to put $1,800 into fixing this. And it turns out that nothing bad's coming out of the exhaust. Whereas other people are driving around thinking, I'm just doing fine. And they're a toxic waste dump because the machine's not catching it. So before we go any further talking about cholesterol, we have to talk about the fact that the machine that's measuring it is broken. And I can tell you how that happened. You know, you're probably too young to remember this. Most people that I tell this to don't remember it. But in the 60s, we had health fairs. And you would go to a health fair to kind of be educated about what was important about health. And there'd be somebody at the booth with a white lab coat. And they'd do a little fingerprint and a little finger prick. Yeah. And they'd say, Mrs. Jones, let's check your cholesterol. Oh, it's 240. Very good. Because at that time, actually, 240 was the amount that was okay. They keep dumbing it down so they get more patients, but they give you one number, and that was your number. Your cholesterol is 220, it's 190, this is good, this is bad. And around 1963-ish, the technology became more common where they could actually look a little more closely and say, you know what, cholesterol actually travels in containers. It doesn't travel in the bloodstream. It's hydrophobic. It won't last 1 second in the bloodstream. It's got to travel in containers. And it looks like they travel in two different kind of containers. One of them is an HDL, a high-density lipoprotein. The other one is an LDL, a low-density lipoprotein. But the L in both of those, HDL and LDL, stands for lipoprotein. That was the boat that carried the cargo of cholesterol. And now we had an improved way of measuring it because HDL and LDL, generally speaking, kind of did different things in the body. And scientists picked a way of describing them, unfortunately, very simplistic way that said HDL, we'll call that the good one, and we'll call LDL the bad one. But basically, there are two kinds of boats, and they're transporting the cargo of cholesterol. Well, that was great for 1963. And what I always say to audiences is the flip phone was great for 1989. You still want to use it when you have an iPhone 12? I mean, come on. So we now know, Dr. Gundry, that there are 13 different subcategories of cholesterol, not 2. Not only that, we know they come in different sizes. And those sizes actually matter. Sometimes the size of a lipoprotein is like a big fluffy tennis ball. It doesn't really do much damage. Other times it's a nasty little atherogenic BB gun particle-sized one. Those sizes matter. The pattern of distribution matters. And what matters the most is the number of lipoproteins. Because think about this. Just as a logical management task, if you've got to manage a crowd of millions of people, there's more likelihood of accidents. There's more likelihood of somebody has a gun. If you're managing a marine and you want to make sure the boats are all safe, the more boats in the water, more likelihood somebody accidentally bumps up against another. If you're a bouncer and a bartender, the more crowded the bar, the more likelihood somebody spills a drink, somebody starts a fight. It's the same thing with the bloodstream. We need to be looking at how many lipoproteins are in the water. And this is the punchline. We have the tests to do all of that. We've got the iPhone 12s and the Galaxy 9s. But doctors are still using this test from 1963. And worse, they're prescribing drugs based upon this test, which is defective. So our first mission is to retire the HDL-LDL test forever and put it on the dustbin of out-of-date ideas where it has long belonged.
Well, so what's the replacement? You obviously have one, and I obviously have one, but I'm interviewing you.
It's the same replacement. We now have this technology. It's called nuclear magnetic resonance, NMR, and there's an MR cholesterol test, and it looks under the hood. And I show people and readers when I'm doing this, with PowerPoint, I show them mine. And it's just there's different tests available to every major lab in the country, LabCorp and Quest. These are the ones your doctor uses. They all offer a version of this. Some of them call it the lipo panel, the advanced lipid profile, the NMR particle test. Doesn't matter. They all look at the same data, which is all the subtypes of cholesterol, the number of boats in the water, which predicts heart disease way better than the amount of cargo in the boat, and finally the pattern of distribution of whether they're big particles or little particles. This is valuable information. This matters. The HDL-LDL test does not.
So I'll give you an example. I do those in my office. That's what we order, and we use several labs to do it. But interestingly, I had a woman yesterday in my office who we go through all this, and she has very few small dense LDL particles. She doesn't oxidize her small dense particles. She doesn't oxidize her ApoB, and we're just kind of talking shop. But we get all done, and I say, you are at so low risk. And she said, how can you say that? Because my cardiologist showed me that my total cholesterol is 242, and I'm a walking time bomb, and I have to be on a statin drug. And this is true. This was yesterday.
I believe you. I'll match your horror story for horror. How about this? I have a very close friend, 69 years old. She doesn't have an ounce of body fat. As a human being, her risk factors for heart disease are probably around 0. Exercises every day. joyous life, great cook, wonderful family, low inflammatory measures. Everything is low blood sugar. It's all perfect, right? She's got a 300 something cholesterol. Her doctor's, you're on a statin or I'm firing you as a patient. Now, we've gone through this for years, and I've said, get the real test and then we'll talk. Wouldn't do it. Nope, we don't need it. So finally, when it was like she was either going to change doctors or he was going to fire her, he says, I'll tell you what, we'll do a compromise. We'll do a calcium coronary scan. And for anybody, I'm sure your audience knows what that is. It's a picture. We're not going to guess because of the cholesterol. We're going to look inside the arteries and see if there's any plaque. And the scores go from 0 to like 1,000, and there's a whole algorithm. And so she's 69. She goes in. She says this, and they say this will be the final arbiter. Fair enough? They take the picture. Her calcium coronary scan is 0. 0. I would die to have that number. She goes back to the doctor. You know what he says? I want to put you on a statin just in case anyway. That's how entrenched this way of thinking is.
Yeah, no, you're absolutely right. And, I have patients with total cholesterols of 300, 400. I have a couple total cholesterol 500 that I manage without statins. Now, you and I think statins may be both overprescribed and potentially underprescribed. And I think before we go any further, to my audience, I'm not telling you to go off statins cold turkey. You need to talk to a doctor about this plan. I do prescribe statins. I use them to drop inflammation until I can teach you how to eat. And then it's very rare that I will use a statin once I teach you how to eat, because quite frankly, you probably won't need it. Okay, so let's address a question that everybody wants to know. If it's not cholesterol, what is the best indicator for determining your heart health?
Well, that is a great question, and I'm so glad you asked it, because it is my mission in life to answer that question to as many audiences as I can. So when we wrote the first edition of The Great Cholesterol Myth 10 years ago, we knew that the search for heart disease in the HDL-LDL test was not the way to go. And we knew the particle test was a huge improvement, but we couldn't say for certain like what we should really be looking at. We knew it wasn't that. We knew there was a hell of a lot more to it than that. But we weren't quite sure. And when we did this deep dive this time around, looking to connect the dots, because remember, I first want to say I'm not an original researcher. I'm not the smart guy that runs the college sophomores and the rats wearing a lab coat and doing the statistical analysis and getting 4 stages of clinical studies done. But I can translate that stuff really well to the audience that I speak to and that I think you speak to, and I'm able to make that clear. And what I went on was a mission to see what research had been done here and what was it and what could we uncover. So we uncovered a very direct line of research, and it has been hiding in plain sight since the 1970s, and it is mind-boggling that doctors do not know this. So in the 70s, there was a doctor named Kraft who discovered the insulin assay. Now, insulin, I'm sure everyone who listens to you knows what insulin is. The very, very important hormone. One of its main things that it does in the body is it clears the bloodstream of excess sugar. It's kind of a sugar sherper. Goes in there, pancreas releases it, comes out, sees the sugar, takes it out, takes it into the muscle cells, drops it off the muscle cells. Great, we need it for energy. Everybody's happy. But in most people, that is not how it works. And the numbers of the percentage of how many people it doesn't work in is staggering. 88% in America was the most recent figure, 52 worldwide, and we think that's an underestimate. So it doesn't work right. What happens is instead of the cells accepting insulin, they reject it. There's just too much sugar, too much noise, too much insulin, and they go, no mas, we gave it the office. They closed their doors, and now your bloodstream, you've got this high sugar and high insulin, the definition of prediabetes. All right. So this insulin resistance, the ability of the cells to just resist the effect of insulin, was something very important. And Kraft figured out a way to measure it. It was a very complicated assay. It required his patients to sit in the office for several hours. They would be hooked up to 2 different infusions. One would infuse sugar, the other would infuse insulin. You'd watch how quickly or how effectively insulin was able to clear that sugar. You could really get perfect lab measures of it. And he developed this great test. And he tested it on like 14,000 patients over the course of his years. And he followed them up. He just wanted to see what happened to people. He put them in categories, 20% categories of very insulin sensitive, which means your blood sugar goes up when you eat, insulin comes right up, bum, 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 it clears it right up, and you're back to normal and everything works in a good. That's about 20% of the population. And it went downhill from there to the next 20%. A little bit insulin resistance, all the way up to major insulin resistance. And these were people with abdominal belly weight and all of the risk factors that go with that. And then he watched to see what happened to these people. So the first 20%, the really insulin sensitive ones, nobody died in 10 years, which is unheard of in a population that size. No major heart attacks or nothing. Then the second group, you start to see disease and death. And it goes up, and it's just like that until you get to the highest level of insulin resistance. And he said, we knew it was kind of the basic condition for diabetes, but it looks like it's connected to a lot of other stuff. Okay, this kind of got buried, and nobody paid much attention to it. In the 1980s, a guy from Stanford comes along named Gerald Reaven, and he invents or labels something called Syndrome X. And Syndrome X was quickly replaced by metabolic syndrome, which is somewhat later replaced by prediabetes. It's all the same thing. And guess what he was talking about? Insulin resistance. And he said, when you have insulin resistance and you have high blood pressure, you have abdominal fat, that's a condition of a group of conditions. We call that metabolic syndrome. It always is prediabetes. Well, we looked at all of this literature. And we made the hypothesis, which is not a big leap of faith, that prediabetes is diabetes. It just hasn't gotten the diagnosis yet. And guess what? Diabetes is pre-heart disease. 80% of diabetics die of heart disease. So when we looked at the literature that Raven had done, which was basically the same thing, he spent his career identifying this insulin resistance as a central cause for diabetes and the entire cardiometabolic stuff. Towards the end of his life and his end of his research, he said, I wonder what else this insulin resistance is related to. And he basically did what Kraft did. He took everybody and he put them in categories. And once again, cancer. Lung disease, kidney disease, there was not a disease that it wasn't linked to. And Dr. Gundry, we put our book out, The Great Cholesterol Myth, late last year, and we basically say insulin resistance is the cause of heart disease. Now, let me put the caveat and the asterisk there. Obviously, it doesn't explain every case of heart disease in the world. There are 3-year-olds who were born with heart disease. But it tracks with heart disease as well as cigarettes track with lung cancer. I mean, cigarettes don't account for every lung cancer case in the world. There are people who get lung cancer who don't smoke, and there are people who smoke a lot and don't get lung cancer. But it sure is a good tracker. It accounts for like 800% increased likelihood. And it's the same thing with insulin resistance. So we wrote our book. We said insulin resistance, we think it's the cause of heart disease, with that caveat. A couple months later, a great doctor that I have great admiration for, Dr. Jason Fung. He's the father of intermittent fasting. He comes out with a book called The Cancer Code, and it says, guess what? Insulin resistance is the cause of cancer. And 2 months later, a PhD who I'd never heard of, who's brilliant, named Dr. Benjamin Brickman, writes a book called Why We Get Sick. And guess what he thinks? Insulin resistance is the cause of everything else. So we've got these 3 independent, I don't even know Brickman, I met Fung once. We've got these people who are kind of coming to the same conclusion, which is insulin resistance is at the core of everything. We know it's at the core of obesity and diabetes and heart disease. And then the take home for this is that if you look at COVID, which is, we're right in the middle right now. In January in California, we're in major lockdown. I don't know what it's like over there, but we're definitely not out of the woods. And we've been in the woods for the better part of a year. No matter where you stand politically on it, this is a serious thing. Look at every comorbidity for COVID, every pre-existing condition that you guys, that we have all been told, oh man, if you've got that thing, that's a bad case, you're immunocompromised. What are they? High blood pressure, pre-diabetes, diabetes, obesity, heart disease. Shall I go on? They're all the same related conditions. And when I realized that, and I said, holy moly, if we could do something about insulin resistance, we'd be wiping out the basis of half of these pre-existing conditions. But I was puzzled. I thought, I don't really know if there's what about lung disease, kidney disease, and liver disease? Because those are big pre-existing conditions also. And I spent no more than a morning on PubMed, on the National Institute of Health Medicine thing, trying to find a relationship between insulin resistance and lung disease and kidney disease. It's right there. There's a literature this long. It underlies all of them. So we really feel this is such an important thing. I have actually talked to others in the Low Carb Clinicians Network about a political action committee to literally lobby the medical authorities to pay attention to insulin resistance and to teach people that you can turn around insulin resistance, you can prevent it, you can treat it, you can reverse it with diet alone. So this is so important for us. I'm not saying, I'd never say anything so simplistic as to say if you wipe out insulin resistance, you won't have deaths from COVID. But I'll bet you the death rate would be a lot different because people are metabolically broken. And any challenge, whether it be viral or any other, is going to be much more opportunistic when you've got a weakened population that you're inflicting that on, right?
Yeah. Oh, yeah. When COVID first came out, I wrote an editorial on Thrive Global on exactly this, that we should actually arm ourselves and the federal government should actually mandate people, believe it or not, rationing sugar and flour, just like we did in World War II, and that we should give people the money to have victory gardens in their yard or their porch, because in World War II, 40% of the food that we ate was grown in home victory gardens. And I said, we know how to do that. We should do it again, because quite frankly, we are at war, and we've now exceeded the deaths from World War II just from COVID. So yeah, I wrote an editorial about that. You're right. We need to empower people. We wouldn't send soldiers to combat unarmed, and yet everybody's unarmed unless we take care of this. All right. So most of my listeners know about insulin resistance. They're hopefully aware of how to reverse insulin resistance, but can you give me your thoughts, a brief overview on how do you reverse insulin resistance?
Well, I always start with, because I do find that it's a somewhat difficult concept to explain to the general public. So I'm always thinking about, how would I explain insulin resistance to a fourth grader? Because once you explain it this way, you see what the solution is very easily. So the way I came up with, and I would love your feedback of whether you think this will land for fourth graders or anybody else who knows nothing about biochemistry. So here's how insulin resistance works. You're a child, and when you were born, you're assigned a bucket, a little pail. And the pail is different for different children. Sorry, that's just the way it is. It's the luck of the draw. Some people get blue eyes, some people get brown eyes, but you get a pail. And for the rest of your life, and that pail may change a little bit, but not much. It's basically the pail that you get. You may eat as many carbohydrates as you can fit in that pail every day. As many as you want. If you eat more, if you try to stuff more into the pail than that pail will hold, there are going to be metabolic problems, and what they are is called insulin resistance. You don't even need to know what it is. It's the inability of your body to process more carbohydrates than fit into your pail. And they may be different amounts for different people. So if you say, well, they eat all those rice in China. Sorry, that ain't your pail. This is your pail. And when you take in more, blood sugar goes up, the pancreas can't keep up with the load, eventually you become insulin resistant, and that is what we've been talking about for the last 45 minutes. So it's basically your body's inability to deal with more sugar and starch than you genetically, hormonally, metabolically, whatever it is, then your pail will allow you to deal with. And that's what it is. So how do we reverse it? The answer is very obvious. We stop trying to shove more carbohydrates into the pail. And for many people, it may take 0 carbohydrates. Their pail may have been so damaged at this point that they can't get anything in there, and you might have to go to 0. Those people are not, I don't think, in the majority, but they do exist. And there are people who've done it very successfully. Carnivore diets, keto diets, no carbohydrates. I think for most people, a little adjustment on what we try to shove into that pail will do the trick. If we just ate less of that stuff, less processed carbohydrates, if we stuck that pail with the ones that filled with fiber, like fibrous vegetables and apples and berries and cantaloupes and grapefruits and things like that, we'd probably do better than if we stuff it with pasta and rice and cereal and breads and crackers and all the other stuff. So the way to reverse insulin resistance is exactly what the cardiologist said to me online at the Scripps Institute when I said, here's my numbers, what should I do? And he said, well, I hope you're eating a high-fat diet. Because think about it. The macronutrient that drives blood sugar and therefore insulin up the most is carbohydrates. The one that drives it up the middle ground is protein. It raises blood sugar a little bit, and it raises insulin a little bit, but nothing like carbohydrates. But the one that doesn't even move the needle on it is fat. So what is the sense of recommending low-fat, high-carb diets to diabetics or to people who are obese or people who cannot manage the stuff that's in their bucket right now? You're going to give more of it? It just makes no sense to me at all. You can reverse insulin resistance with a higher-fat, lower-carb diet, period. It works every time.
This LDL cholesterol doesn't cause a heart attack. This one does. This one is increased by eating saturated fats. This one is increased by processed carbs. This one is lowered by a statin. This one isn't. When you take a statin, you lower the LDL here in your blood. Let's worry about this junk here. This isn't lowered by a statin. It's not easy to reverse this, but lowering your inflammation is key. Lower your insulin and lower your inflammation. Doctors hand out statins like candy to anyone with risk factors for heart disease. I don't prescribe statins as the first-line treatment for heart attacks because the science simply isn't there.
I want to talk about, hands down, the best remedy to prevent heart attacks, okay? And you're going to be asking yourself, why have I not heard about this before? Why isn't this in the news? Well, because there's no money in it. That's really the bottom line. Who's going to promote it unless they make money on it? No one. A bottle of this remedy, which has hardcore scientific data to show that it can prevent heart attacks, is only $3.19, okay? $3. So if you say you can't afford it, well, I think you can. Now, I'm going to put a lot of the research down below. One study called the Coronary Drug Project, which was placebo-controlled, used this nutrient, okay, to show incredible results. But the remedy is niacin. Now, it's funny because my dad had heart problems. He had a pacemaker, had atrial fibrillation. And without my recommendation, he chows down these niacin tablets like all day long. And he seems to be doing pretty good. But there's a lot of research on niacin that goes back decades. And you want to get the niacin that gives you the flush. I would recommend an extended release niacin at 500 milligrams and do at least one a day. All right, so let's talk about what it can actually do. It significantly lowers your cholesterol, specifically oxidized LDL. Okay, that's the type that creates inflammation. It has potent cardiovascular protection. It has been found to lower the white blood cell reaction in the inside of your arteries, because when your body is forming plaque in atherosclerosis, you have an immune part of that as well that is usually responsible for inflammation, which we don't want a lot of inflammation in our arteries. Well, niacin decreases monocytes and other white blood cells and the inflammation that comes along with it. Niacin significantly lowers something called CRP, C-reactive protein. C-reactive protein is a strong predictor of mortality. C-reactive protein is a very strong independent predictor of heart attacks, or you can call them myocardial infarction, peripheral vascular disease, and stroke. If there's high levels of C-reactive protein in your body, you have inflammation, okay? And niacin can help squash that. You see, when a clot forms or plaque forms in the arteries, you always have first this oxidation going on. Well, guess what? Niacin suppresses that oxidation. It acts as a very powerful antioxidant, as one of the things it can do. And I think the biggest thing why it's so powerful is it gets rid of vascular inflammation, and it prevents the lipids or the fats from depositing on the arterial wall. It also reduces triglycerides too. And at the same time, it increases the HDL. So niacin has the power to slow and reverse arterial sclerosis. And I know you're wondering, why haven't I heard about this? Why isn't this promoted all over the place? Well, like I said, there's no money in it. Niacin can decrease the mortality risk in people that have cardiovascular disease. Niacin tends to prevent dysfunction in that inner layer of the artery called the endothelial layer, which is where it all starts. And it significantly reduces the adhesions that form in that wall. Now, on the flip side, a lot of people that have high cholesterol are taking statins. So let's just kind of touch on that while we're on the topic. So it is true that statins do block and lower cholesterol, okay? But there's no evidence that it reduces the risk of getting heart attacks. But basically, statins work by blocking your body's production of cholesterol. The problem with that is that to make bile salts, you need cholesterol. And without bile salts, you can't now absorb vitamin A, D, E, which is very, very important, K1, K2, which is another vitamin that's very, very important, keeping the calcium out of the arteries. Also, you need that cholesterol to make testosterone. So a lot of people on statins end up with very low testosterone. You know, there's actually no long-term placebo-controlled statin trials. I guess they can't do them in humans, so it's a big unknown whether statins really increase your life or not. But what we do know, they have a lot of side effects, especially to anything related to your muscles. They block something called coenzyme Q10 that the mitochondria needs within your muscle cells. And your heart is a muscle. And so some of the side effects are muscle wasting, okay, heart failure, all sorts of achiness in your muscles, including low back pain and other types of pains. So I'm not telling you to get off your statins. All I'm telling you is to research, get the data, show this data to your doctor. I'll put the links down below, an informed decision based on the data versus the general consensus of what everyone's recommending. So if you're concerned about your heart and you have heart issues and you're on medication for the heart, you may want to consider taking this niacin. It's very, very inexpensive. Get the extended release, 500 milligrams, take at least one per day.